The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek, causing Florence Montgomery to flinch as she stepped off the stagecoach that had been her home for the past 3 days. The year was 1875, and the small Montana town that would be her new home seemed as wild and untamed as the stories she'd heard back east. Florence straightened her travel-worn dress and clutched her small valise tighter, her knuckles whitening as she surveyed the main street. Men in dusty clothes lounged outside the saloon, their curious gazes following her every move. She had never felt more out of place than at this moment, a 22-year-old schoolteacher from Boston who had answered an advertisement for an educator in this frontier town. The stagecoach driver tossed down her trunk unceremoniously, raising a cloud of dust that made her cough delicately into her handkerchief. "Welcome to Willow Creek, miss," he said with a toothless grin. "Hope you survive longer than the last schoolmarm." Florence's heart sank at his ominous words, but she squared her shoulders. "I'm certain I shall manage just fine, sir. Thank you for your concern." As the stagecoach rattled away, Florence stood alone on the wooden boardwalk, uncertain of her next move. The advertisement had promised accommodations, but no one seemed to be waiting to receive her. "You must be the new teacher." The deep voice startled her, and Florence turned to find herself looking up at a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore a well-worn hat pulled low over his forehead, and the badge pinned to his vest caught the late afternoon sunlight. "Sheriff Wade Turner," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Town council asked me to meet you, but looks like the stage arrived early." Florence nodded, trying to maintain her composure despite her fatigue. "Florence Montgomery, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, Sheriff." His eyes swept over her, taking in her travel-crumpled dress and the determined set of her chin. Something in his gaze softened. "You're a long way from home, Miss Montgomery." "Yes, well, I believe new beginnings often require distance," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. A faint smile touched his lips as he reached down to lift her heavy trunk with ease. "You're right about that." He nodded toward the end of the street. "Boarding house is this way. Mrs. Holloway's expecting you." Florence followed him, trying to keep pace with his long strides while taking in the town that would be her home. Willow Creek was smaller than she had imagined, a single main street with wooden buildings on either side, a church steeple visible at one end, and mountains rising in the distance. The scent of pine mingled with dust and horse manure, so different from the coal smoke and sea air of Boston. "It's not much," Sheriff Turner said, seeming to read her thoughts, "but it's growing. 43 children waiting for schooling now." 43. Florence couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "The advertisement mentioned perhaps 20? Town's growing faster than anyone expected." "Silver Mine opened up last year about 10 miles north." He glanced at her. "Is that going to be a problem?" Florence swallowed hard but shook her head. "No, no problem at all. I'm here to teach, whether it's 20 children or 100. They reached a 2-story wooden building with a small, neat garden out front. A hand-painted sign hanging from the porch, Eve Reed, Holloway Boarding House. "Here we are," the sheriff said, setting her trunk down on the porch and knocking on the door. A plump woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun opened the door, her face breaking into a welcoming smile. "You must be our new schoolteacher. Come in, come in. I've got your room all ready and supper's nearly on the table." Florence thanked the sheriff, who tipped his hat once more before turning to leave. As she watched him walk away, Mrs. Holloway leaned closer. "Don't mind the sheriff's gruff manner," the older woman said. "Lost his wife to fever 3 years back. Hasn't been the same since, but he's a good man." Florence nodded, wondering why that information made her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. She had her own ghosts, after all. She wasn't here to form attachments, but to make a new life for herself, one where no one knew her past. Mrs. Holloway showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor. A narrow bed, a washstand, a dresser, and a small writing desk comprised the furnishings. The window overlooked the main street, and in the distance, Florence could see the mountains, their peaks turning golden in the setting sun. "Town council meeting tomorrow evening," Mrs. Holloway informed her as she set Florence's trunk at the foot of the bed. "They'll want to meet you proper. School starts Monday next, giving you a few days to settle in." Left alone, Florence sank onto the bed, exhaustion washing over her. She had traveled over 2,000 miles to escape the whispers and pitying looks that had followed her in Boston after William had broken their engagement. William, who had courted her for 2 years only to jilt her for her younger, prettier cousin. William, who had told her with cruel honesty that while she was intelligent and would make a fine wife for someone practical, she lacked the beauty and charm he wanted in a bride. Florence touched her plain face, her fingers tracing the features she had long ago accepted as unremarkable. Her father had called her handsome once, but that was the closest thing to a compliment her appearance had ever received. She had made peace with her looks, or so she thought, until William's rejection had reopened old wounds. So she had fled west, as far as she could go, to a place where she might be valued for her mind and her skills rather than judged for her lack of beauty. She unpacked her few belongings, arranging her books on the small shelf above the desk. Tomorrow she would begin her new life in earnest. Tonight, she would rest and prepare herself for whatever challenges this wild country might bring. The town council meeting was held in the church, the only building in Willow Creek large enough to accommodate the 15 men who comprised the leadership of the community. Florence sat on a hard wooden chair at the front, acutely aware of the scrutiny she was under as the only woman present. Mayor Franklin, a portly man with an impressive mustache, introduced her to the townsfolk who had gathered to meet the new teacher. "Miss Montgomery comes highly recommended from Boston," he announced proudly. "Got herself a proper education at a ladies' seminary and taught at a fine school back east." Florence rose and nodded politely, feeling like a specimen under a microscope as curious eyes examined her. "Why'd you come west, miss?" called a voice from the back. "Ain't many refined ladies choose frontier life willingly." Before she could answer, Sheriff Turner spoke up from his position against the wall. "Reckon that's Miss Montgomery's business, Johnson. She's here to teach, not satisfy your curiosity." The man who had asked the question subsided with a mumbled apology, and Florence shot the sheriff a grateful look. "I would like to see the schoolhouse," she said, addressing the mayor, "to prepare my lessons appropriately." "Sheriff Turner can show you tomorrow," Mayor Franklin replied. "He's been overseeing the repairs." The meeting continued with discussions of town matters that had little to do with her, and Florence found her attention wandering to the tall figure of the sheriff. There was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that seemed to anchor the room. When their eyes met briefly across the crowded space, she looked away quickly, an unfamiliar warmth rising to her cheeks. The next morning, Sheriff Turner appeared at the boarding house just after breakfast. Florence was ready, dressed in one of her plainest dresses, her hair pulled back in its usual severe bun. "Morning, Miss Montgomery," he greeted her, hat in hand. "Ready to see your schoolhouse?" The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a one-room building with a small bell tower. Inside, Florence found rows of rough-hewn benches and desks, a wood stove in the corner, and a teacher's desk on a slightly raised platform. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating the fresh whitewash on the walls. "It's not fancy," Sheriff Turner said, watching her face carefully. "But the town pitched in to fix it up proper for you." Florence ran her hand over the smooth surface of her desk, touched by the evident care that had gone into preparing the space. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Really?" He sounded surprised. "Yes. A good teacher needs attentive students and adequate materials more than grand surroundings." She gestured to the bookshelves behind her desk. "Though I do notice the library is somewhat limited. Town's ordered more books, should arrive on next month's supply wagon." He hesitated, then added, "Got some books at my office you can borrow till then. Nothing fancy, but might help." Florence smiled at him, genuinely pleased by the offer. That would be most appreciated, Sheriff. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Most folks call me Wade, he finally said. Might as well do the same, seeing as we'll be working together on town matters. Very well, Wade. His name felt strange on her tongue, oddly intimate. And you may call me Florence if you wish. Florence, he repeated, and something in the way he said it made her heart beat faster. It suits you. Before she could respond to this unexpected comment, the door to the schoolhouse banged open, and a young boy of perhaps 10 years burst in, skidding to a halt when he saw them. Sheriff. Pa sent me to fetch you. There's trouble at the saloon. Mr. Daniels and Mr. Heath are fixing to shoot each other. Wade sighed and settled his hat back on his head. Duty calls. You all right finding your way back, Miss Montgomery? Perfectly capable, thank you, she assured him, already turning her attention to organizing her desk. Be seeing you then. He strode out, his long legs carrying him swiftly as the boy raced alongside him. Left alone in her schoolhouse, Florence took a deep breath, savoring the smell of chalk, dust, and fresh wood. This was her domain now, a place where she could build something meaningful. She began making lists of supplies needed, lessons to prepare, and rules to establish. Work had always been her sanctuary, and she immersed herself in it gladly. By Monday morning, Florence was as prepared as she could be for her first day of teaching. She arrived at the schoolhouse an hour early, arranging books and writing the day's lessons on the blackboard. Her hands trembled slightly with nervous anticipation as she heard the first childish voices approaching. The students filed in a diverse group ranging from tiny 5-year-olds to gangly teenagers close to adulthood. Some were neatly dressed in their Sunday best, while others wore patched clothing that spoke of harder circumstances. All regarded her with wary curiosity. Good morning, she said, keeping her voice firm but kind. I am Miss Montgomery, your new teacher. A small girl in the front row raised her hand immediately. Are you going to leave like the last teacher, miss? She only stayed 2 months. Florence met the child's earnest gaze. I have no plans to leave unless you all decide to drive me away with poor behavior. She allowed a small smile to soften her words. Shall we begin with introductions? The morning passed in a flurry of activity as Florence assessed her students' widely varying levels of education. Some of the older children could barely read, while a few younger ones showed surprising aptitude. By noon, when she rang the bell for the midday break, Florence felt cautiously optimistic. She was arranging the afternoon lessons when a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Wade stood there, holding a basket. Mrs. Holloway sent this, he said, setting the basket on her desk. Said you forgot your lunch. That was thoughtful of her, Florence replied, though she had intentionally skipped packing a lunch, preferring to use the time for preparation. Wade lingered, looking around the schoolroom. How's the first day going? Better than expected. The children seem eager to learn for the most part. They need this, he said quietly. Education, future, something better than. He gestured vaguely toward the town. Florence tilted her head, studying him. You don't seem to think much of Willow Creek, Sheriff, for a man who's sworn to protect it. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I think plenty of it. Just know there's more out there. Want these kids to have choices I never had. Before she could ask what he meant, the children began returning from their break, eyeing the sheriff with interest. He tipped his hat to her and departed, leaving Florence with questions she had no right to ask. The weeks fell into a rhythm as autumn painted the surrounding mountains with splashes of gold and crimson. Florence found herself increasingly comfortable in her role as Willow Creek's teacher. The children responded well to her firm but fair approach, and even the most resistant students began showing improvement. She saw Wade frequently, though always in passing a nod on the street, a brief exchange after church services, an occasional delivery of books he thought might interest her students. There was a careful distance between them, maintained by mutual unspoken agreement, yet Florence couldn't deny the flutter in her chest whenever he appeared. One crisp October afternoon, as Florence was dismissing her students, she noticed a commotion on the main street. A group of rough-looking men had ridden into town, their loud voices carrying clearly to the schoolhouse. The children's eyes widened with recognition and fear. "Inside, everyone," Florence ordered sharply. "Billy, run and tell Sheriff Turner we're keeping the children here until those men leave town." The 12-year-old nodded solemnly and darted away, while Florence herded the remaining children back into the schoolhouse, locking the door behind them. Through the window, she watched the newcomers dismount outside the saloon, their swagger and loud voices suggesting they were already in their cups despite the early hour. "Miss Montgomery." A small voice drew her attention downward. 6-year-old Emma Miller clutched her slate to her chest, blue eyes wide with worry. "Those are the Harker brothers. My pa says they're bad men." Florence forced a reassuring smile. "Well, that's why we have Sheriff Turner. Now, why don't we use this extra time for a special lesson?" "Who would like to hear a story?" She kept the children engaged with tales from Greek mythology, all the while watching the street through the window. Relief washed over her when she spotted Wade approaching the saloon, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. An hour later, a knock at the schoolhouse door made the children jump. Florence approached cautiously. "Who is it?" Wade Turner. She unlocked the door to find the sheriff looking grim but unharmed. "All clear," he said quietly. "Parents are waiting at my office to collect their children." Florence organized the students into an orderly line and walked them to the sheriff's office, where anxious parents waited. As the last child departed, she turned to Wade. "Who were those men?" "Trouble," he replied tersely. "Cattle rustlers from over the state line. They're moving on, but—" He hesitated, then added, "Might be best if someone walked you home for the next few days, just to be safe." "Are you offering, Sheriff?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Reckon I am, Miss Montgomery," and so began a new routine. Each afternoon, Wade would appear at the schoolhouse door to escort Florence back to the boarding house. Their walks were filled with conversation that gradually moved from town matters to more personal topics. "How did you come to be a sheriff?" Florence asked one evening as they strolled past the general store. Wade was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "Was a cavalry scout during the war," he finally said. "After, drifted west. Was deputy in a town over in Idaho when my brother wrote that his wife was expecting their first child. Came here to be close to family." "And your brother? Is he still in Willow Creek?" Pain flashed across Wade's face. "No, lost him and Sarah both to the fever that swept through 3 years back." "Their boy, too." "I'm so sorry," Florence said softly, understanding now the shadow that sometimes darkened his eyes. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you lost your wife." "Mary wasn't my wife," Wade corrected gently. "She was my brother's. Folks just assumed after." "Well, easier to let them think that sometimes." Florence absorbed this revelation, wondering why it made her heart beat faster. "And you stayed on as sheriff, even after losing your family here." Someone had to look after the town. He shrugged, as if the years of lonely duty were nothing remarkable. "Besides, where else would I go?" They had reached the boarding house porch, and Florence paused, reluctant for their conversation to end. "Thank you for walking me home, Sheriff." "Wade," he reminded her, his voice dropping lower. "Wade," she echoed, meeting his gaze for a moment. Something electric passed between them, a current of unspoken possibility. Then Wade stepped back, touching the brim of his hat. "Good night, Florence." She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun, and acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. She was developing feelings for Wade Turner, feelings that went far beyond gratitude or friendship. November brought early snows to the mountains surrounding Willow Creek. The schoolhouse was often chilly, despite the roaring fire Florence maintained in the wood stove, and the children arrived with red cheeks and mittened hands each morning. One Friday afternoon, as Florence was gathering her materials after dismissing class, the door opened to admit Wade, carrying an armload of firewood. "Thought you might need this," he said, stacking the logs neatly beside the wood stove. "Storm's coming in, going to be a cold one tonight." "Thank you." Florence wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The children mentioned there might be no school Monday if the snow is heavy." Wade nodded, brushing wood chips from his coat. "Happens every winter. First big snow, town shuts down for a day or two." He glanced at her. "You prepared for a proper Montana winter, Boston?" Florence smiled ruefully. "I thought I was, but I'm beginning to doubt my assumptions." "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the door. "Let's get you home before it starts." Outside, the sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of snow. The wind had picked up, carrying a biting chill that cut through Florence's woolen coat. Wade noticed her shiver and frowned. "That coat's not nearly thick enough," he observed. "Need proper winter gear out here." "I'll manage," Florence replied, not wanting to admit that her teacher's salary left little room for such purchases after sending money home to her ailing mother each month. They had barely reached the main street when the first snowflakes began to fall fat, wet flakes that quickly increased in intensity. By the time they reached the general store, the snow was falling heavily, reducing visibility to just a few yards. "Best wait it out," Wade decided, guiding her onto the store's covered porch. "These early storms sometimes blow through quick." But after 15 minutes, the snow showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was falling more heavily, driven by gusting winds that created near whiteout conditions. Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, stuck his head out the door. "Better come inside, you two. This one's settling in for the duration." The store was warm and fragrant with the smells of coffee, tobacco, and spices. Several other townspeople had also sought shelter there, gathered around the pot-bellied stove in the center of the room. "Sheriff, Miss Montgomery," Mayor Franklin called from his place near the stove. "Join us. Peterson's breaking out the good coffee." Florence accepted a steaming mug gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around it. As the afternoon wore on, and the storm showed no signs of breaking, the impromptu gathering took on a festive air. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon lively music filled the store as people pushed aside barrels and crates to clear space for dancing. "Might as well make the best of it," Mrs. Peterson laughed, distributing cookies from a large tin. "We're all stuck here till this passes." Florence watched as couples took to the makeshift dance floor, their faces flushed with exertion and joy. She stood against the wall, content to observe, until Wade appeared before her, hat in hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Montgomery?" he asked formally, though his eyes held a teasing light. Florence hesitated. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," he admitted with a slight smile, "but seems ashamed to miss out." Before she could formulate another excuse, he had taken her hand and led her into the circle of dancers. His hand at her waist was firm but gentle as he guided her through the steps of a simple waltz. Florence followed his lead, surprised by how natural it felt to move with him. "You dance very well for someone who claims no skill," she observed, looking up at him. "Had a good teacher," he replied. "My mother insisted all her sons learn, said no lady would marry a man who couldn't dance proper." "A wise woman, your mother," Wade's expression softened with memory. "She would have liked you, I think." "Why is that? Strong-minded, independent, not afraid of hard work." His eyes met hers. "Beautiful." Florence nearly missed a step, certain she had misheard him. No one had ever called her beautiful, not her father, not William, not any of the young men she had known in Boston. She had long ago accepted that beauty was not among her attributes. "You needn't say such things, Sheriff," she said quietly. "I am quite aware of my appearance." Wade's brow furrowed. "What things?" "Flattery," she clarified, her cheeks warming. "I prefer honesty in all matters. Being honest," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Thought you were beautiful first day I saw you step off that stage. Sunlight in your hair, chin up like you were ready to take on the whole frontier single-handed." Florence couldn't speak, too stunned by his words and the sincerity in his eyes. The music ended, saving her from having to respond, but Wade kept hold of her hand as they left the dance floor. "Storm's letting up," someone called from near the window. "Roads'll be passable soon." Indeed, the snow had slowed to gentle flurries, and patches of dark sky were visible between the clouds. People began gathering their belongings, preparing to make their way home through the fresh snow. Wade helped Florence into her coat. "I'll see you home." The world outside had been transformed into a wonderland of white. The snow muffled their footsteps as they walked, creating an intimate silence broken only by the occasional distant sound of doors closing or voices calling goodnight. "What I said before," Wade began as they approached the boarding house, "didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Florence gathered her courage. "No one has ever called me beautiful before," she admitted. "It was unexpected." Wade stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Snowflakes caught in his dark hair and on the shoulders of his coat as he studied her face in the dim light spilling from nearby windows. "Then no one's really looked at you," he said simply. "Not properly." Before Florence could respond, Mrs. Holloway appeared on the porch, calling her name with obvious relief. The moment shattered, leaving Florence with a jumble of emotions she couldn't begin to sort out as she thanked Wade and hurried inside. That night, as she prepared for bed, Florence found herself standing before the small mirror above her washstand, really looking at herself perhaps for the first time in years. Her brown hair, usually pulled back severely, fell in waves around her face. Her eyes, which she had always thought of as merely brown, caught the lamplight with flecks of gold. Her features, while not conforming to the current fashion for delicate, doll-like beauty, had a certain harmony. Was this what Wade saw when he looked at her? Not beauty as defined by Boston society, but something else entirely. The thought kept her awake long into the night, along with the memory of his hand at her waist and the way he had said her name, as if it were something precious. The snow continued intermittently through the weekend, but by Monday morning, the roads were clear enough for school to resume. Florence threw herself into her teaching with renewed vigor, using the work to distract herself from thoughts of Wade and the confusing emotions he stirred in her. For his part, Wade seemed to be keeping his distance. Their daily walks continued, but the conversations remained safely impersonal, focused on town matters and the children's progress. Florence told herself this was for the best, even as she missed the growing closeness they had shared before. As Thanksgiving approached, the town began preparations for its annual celebration. The holiday would be marked by a community dinner in the church, followed by a dance. Florence found herself on the committee responsible for decorations, working alongside several of her students' mothers. "You'll be wanting something special to wear, Miss Montgomery," Mrs. Peterson remarked as they cut paper decorations one afternoon. "First Thanksgiving in Willow Creek is always memorable." "I'm sure my Sunday dress will be quite adequate," Florence replied, concentrating on her scissors. "Nonsense," Mrs. Baker interjected. "Half the unmarried men in the county attend our Thanksgiving dance. It's practically a tradition for at least one engagement to follow." "I assure you, I have no interest in such outcomes," Florence said firmly. The women exchanged knowing looks that Florence pretended not to notice. Since arriving in Willow Creek, she had politely but definitively discouraged the attentions of the few single men who had shown interest. William's rejection had left deeper scars than she cared to admit, and she had no desire to risk her heart again. And yet, when she thought of Wade, of his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness, she wondered if perhaps she was being overly cautious. Then she would remind herself sternly that the sheriff had shown no clear romantic intentions beyond a few kind words that might mean nothing at all. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold. Florence spent the morning helping her students rehearse the short program they would present before dinner recitations of poetry, and a few songs they had practiced diligently. She returned to the boarding house at noon to change. selecting her best dress, a deep burgundy wool with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. As she pinned up her hair, she allowed herself a small indulgence, leaving a few soft curls framing her face instead of scraping everything back in her usual severe style. The effect was subtle but transformative, softening her features in a way that made her pause before the mirror in surprise. The church was already crowded when Florence arrived, laden with the apple pies she had baked the previous day. Children ran excitedly between the long tables that had been set up in the nave, while women bustled about arranging dishes and men gathered in groups, talking of cattle prices and mining prospects. Florence was directing her students to their positions for the program when she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Wade watching her, his expression unreadable. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His usually unruly dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean shirt and string tie with his best waistcoat. "Sheriff," she greeted him, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. "Miss Montgomery." He cleared his throat. "You look very nice." "Thank you, as do you." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Mayor Franklin called for everyone's attention to begin the proceedings. Florence hurried to organize her students, grateful for the distraction. The children performed admirably, earning enthusiastic applause from the assembled townsfolk. Dinner followed a bountiful spread featuring several roast turkeys, venison, and every imaginable side dish and dessert. Florence found herself seated between Mrs. Holloway and the town doctor, with Wade at a different table entirely, surrounded by town council members. After the meal, the church was quickly transformed for dancing. Benches were pushed against the walls, and the small group of local musicians took their places near the pulpit. Florence was immediately approached by Mr. Stevens, the young bank clerk who had been trying to gain her favor since her arrival. "May I have the first dance, Miss Montgomery?" he asked eagerly. Unable to think of a polite refusal, Florence accepted, allowing him to lead her onto the floor for a lively Virginia reel. Dance followed dance, and Florence found herself partnered with a succession of the town's eligible men, none of whom held her interest despite their obvious enthusiasm. During a brief respite, Florence escaped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky above. She leaned against the church wall, enjoying the quiet after the noise and heat inside. Hiding out. Wade's voice came from the shadows beside the steps. Florence started slightly. "Merely catching my breath," she replied. "It's rather warm inside." He stepped closer, into the pool of light spilling from the church windows. "Seems like you're popular tonight. Stevens looks about ready to propose." There was something in his tone, a hint of tension or perhaps jealousy that made Florence's pulse quicken. "Mr. Stevens would be wasting his time. I have no intention of accepting proposals from anyone in Willow Creek." "No." Wade moved closer still, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight unevenness of his beard where an old scar interrupted its growth. "Planning to move on, then?" Florence shook her head. "No, I simply—" "That is, I came here to teach, not to find a husband." "Can't a woman do both?" The directness of his question took her breath away. "I suppose some can. I, however, learned the hard way that I am not suited for that sort of arrangement." Wade's brow furrowed. "What happened, Florence?" Perhaps it was the use of her given name or the genuine concern in his voice, but Florence found herself telling him what she had told no one else in Willow Creek. "I was engaged, back in Boston. He decided another would suit him better. My cousin, as it happens. They married last spring." "Fool," Wade said with such quiet conviction that Florence looked up in surprise. "Man would have to be blind or senseless to choose anyone over you." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a barrier falling away, leaving only truth in its wake. Wade, the church door opened, spilling light and music and laughter into the night. Mrs. Holloway peered out. "There you are, Florence. Come in, dear, they're about to start the next set." The moment broken, Florence allowed herself to be led back inside, though her thoughts remained with the man standing alone in the darkness. The weeks leading up to Christmas were filled with activity. Florence's students were preparing a special program for the holiday, which required extra rehearsals and the creation of costumes and props. The town itself was transformed with evergreen boughs and red ribbons adorning the storefronts, and even the saloon sported a small decorated tree in its window. Wade continued to walk Florence home each afternoon, but a new awareness hummed between them, unspoken but undeniable. Their conversations deepened, venturing into childhood memories, favorite books, hopes for the future. Florence found herself looking forward to those walks with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. One afternoon, as they passed the general store, Wade hesitated. "Got something to show you, if you've got time." Curious, Florence followed him inside. Mr. Peterson greeted them with a knowing smile that she pretended not to notice. Wade led her to the counter where a selection of winter goods was displayed. "Ordered this from back east," he said, lifting a package wrapped in brown paper. "For you." Florence stared at him in surprise. "For me? But why open it?" he encouraged, a rare hint of nervousness in his voice. She carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a coat beautifully made of thick wool in a deep forest green, with a matching hat and muffler. The coat was lined with soft flannel, and decorative buttons marched down the front. "Wade," she breathed, running her fingers over the fine material. "It's beautiful, but I can't possibly accept." "Yes, you can," he interrupted gently. "Been watching you shiver for weeks in that eastern coat of yours. Montana winters need proper gear." When she still hesitated, he added, "Consider it an early Christmas gift. It's far too generous." "Try it on," he urged, ignoring her protest. Florence slipped the coat over her shoulders, immediately enveloped in its warmth. It fit perfectly, as if made for her. "How did you know my size?" she asked, buttoning it with fingers that trembled slightly. Wade's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Mrs. Holloway helped with that part." Mr. Peterson beamed approvingly. "Looks like it was made for you, Miss Montgomery." Florence knew she should refuse the gift. It was too personal, too expensive, but the warmth in Wade's eyes made refusal impossible. "Thank you," she said simply. "I shall treasure it." Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting lazily from a pearl-gray sky. Florence pulled on the new hat, reveling in its snug warmth. "Suits you," Wade observed as they walked toward the boarding house. "The color brings out your eyes." Florence felt herself blushing, still unused to such compliments. "It was very thoughtful of you." They walked in companionable silence for a while, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. At the boarding house steps, Florence paused. "Would you like to come in for tea, Mrs. Holloway always has a pot ready this time of day." Wade hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. I'd like that." Mrs. Holloway welcomed them warmly, exclaiming over the new coat with obvious approval. She served tea and fresh baked cookies in the parlor, then discreetly left them alone, mentioning something about laundry that needed tending. "Your student's Christmas program is next Friday, isn't it?" Wade asked, warming his hands around his teacup. Florence nodded. "Yes, and I fear we're woefully underprepared. Little Emma still can't remember her lines and the boys' choir." She shook her head ruefully. "They'll do fine," Wade assured her. "Whole town's looking forward to it." "Will you attend?" Florence asked, trying to sound casual. "Wouldn't miss it." His eyes met hers over the rim of his cup. "Haven't missed a single thing you've been involved with since you arrived." The simple statement made Florence's heart skip. "I've noticed," she admitted softly. Wade set down his cup and leaned forward, his expression serious. "Florence, there's something I need to ask you." A sudden knock at the front door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Mrs. Holloway hurried to answer it, returning moments later with a worried expression. "Sheriff, it's Mr. Davis from the mine. Says there's been an accident cave-in with men trapped." Wade was on his feet instantly, all trace of the relaxed man gone, replaced by the efficient lawman. "How many?" 3, sir. They're organizing rescue efforts now, but they need every able body. Wade nodded grimly, already reaching for his coat. Tell him I'll be right there. He turned to Florence. I'm sorry, go, she said immediately. They need you. He paused at the door, looking back at her. Rain, check on that conversation. Of course, she replied, though anxiety knotted her stomach as she watched him stride away through the falling snow. The mine accident cast a pall over the town. 3 men were trapped for nearly 2 days before rescuers could reach them. 2 survived, 1 did not. The funeral was held on Sunday, a somber affair that the entire town attended. Florence saw little of Wade during this time. He was constantly at the mine, coordinating rescue efforts, then handling the aftermath, comforting the widow, arranging for financial assistance, maintaining order when angry miners threatened violence against the foreman they blamed for inadequate safety measures. When he finally appeared at the schoolhouse on Tuesday afternoon, he looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and new lines of strain on his face. You look as though you haven't slept in days, Florence observed with concern as they began their walk. Haven't much, he admitted. Been a rough few days. Is there anything I can do? Wade shook his head. You're already doing it. Town needs normality, children learning, life going on. He glanced at her. Heard the Christmas program's still on for Friday. Yes, though I offered to postpone it. Mayor Franklin thought it might lift spirits. He's right. Wade ran a hand through his hair, which was more disheveled than usual. Could use something good right about now. They walked in silence for a while, Florence sensing that Wade wasn't ready to talk further about the accident or its aftermath. At the boarding house, she impulsively touched his arm. Would you join us for dinner tonight, Mrs. Holloway always makes too much, and you look like you could use a proper meal. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, but then he nodded. Thank you, I'd appreciate that. Dinner was a quiet affair. Wade ate with the mechanical movements of a man fueling his body rather than enjoying a meal, though he complimented Mrs. Holloway's cooking politely. Afterward, when the landlady withdrew to the kitchen, Florence poured Wade a cup of coffee and sat across from him at the table. Talk to me, she said quietly. You're carrying too much alone. Wade stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. Keep thinking I could have prevented it somehow. Mine's been cutting corners on safety. Knew it, but couldn't prove it. You can't blame yourself for others' negligence. Can when it's my job to protect people. He looked up, his eyes haunted. Phillips left a wife and 3 kids. Youngest is only 2. Florence reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. And you'll make sure they're taken care of because that's who you are. But you can't carry the weight of every tragedy, Wade. It will crush you. He turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. How'd you get so wise, Florence Montgomery? Not wisdom, she replied softly. Experience. I watched my father destroy himself trying to save everyone after the war. He was a doctor, couldn't accept that some wounds can't be healed. Wade squeezed her hand gently. I'm sorry. As am I, for Mr. Phillips and his family. But grief doesn't diminish by one person carrying more than their share. They sat in companionable silence, hands still joined across the table, until Mrs. Holloway bustled back in with dessert. If she noticed their linked hands, she gave no sign beyond a small, approving smile. Friday arrived with a fresh snowfall that blanketed Willow Creek in pristine white. The schoolhouse was transformed for the Christmas program, with evergreen boughs decorating the windows and a small tree in the corner, adorned with paper ornaments the children had made. Despite Florence's concerns, the program went remarkably well. Emma remembered all her lines, the boys' choir sang with unexpected harmony, and the nativity scene brought tears to more than one parent's eye. Afterward, the room filled with chatter and laughter as refreshments were served and gifts exchanged. Florence was distributing small presents to her students when she noticed Wade standing near the back of the room, watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. He had clearly gone home to change after his duties. His hair was damp from washing, and he wore a clean shirt under his best waistcoat. As the crowd began to thin, he made his way toward her. "Successful evening, teacher," he said with a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in days. "You should be proud." "They did all the work," Florence demurred. "I merely provided direction." "False modesty doesn't suit you." Wade's tone was teasing, but his eyes were serious. "You've changed this town, Florence. These kids, their families, everyone can see it." Before she could respond, little Emma Miller tugged at her skirt. "Miss Montgomery, you forgot your gift." Florence looked down in surprise. "My gift?" Emma nodded eagerly, pointing to the tree where a small package wrapped in brown paper sat on a branch. "Sheriff Turner brought it special." Florence glanced at Wade, who looked suspiciously innocent. "Did he now?" "Open it," Emma urged, practically bouncing with excitement. Under the watchful eyes of her remaining students and their parents, Florence carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. When she opened it, a sweet melody began to play a music box. "It's beautiful," she breathed, touching the polished wood gently. "Look inside," Emma prompted. Florence lifted the small tray that held the musical mechanism. Beneath it, nestled in a bed of velvet, was a delicate silver pendant, a small book with actual tiny pages that opened, hanging from a fine chain. "Oh," she whispered, lifting it carefully. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The book even had minuscule words engraved on its pages. "It's a locket," Wade explained quietly, now standing beside her, "for keeping important things close." Florence opened the tiny book to find it empty, waiting to be filled. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him with shining eyes. "It's perfect." "Merry Christmas, Florence," he replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The remaining parents and children were gathering their belongings, calling out Christmas wishes as they departed. Soon, Florence and Wade were alone in the schoolhouse, the only light coming from the lamps she had lit earlier and the moon shining through the windows. "Let me help you clean up," Wade offered, already moving to collect abandoned cups and plates. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, until the room was restored to order. Florence stood by her desk, the music box and pendant still in her hands. "I have something for you as well," she said, setting them down carefully to open her desk drawer. "Though it seems rather inadequate now." She handed him a package wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. Wade unwrapped it to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in a deep blue that matched his eyes, along with a pair of leather gloves. "Made the scarf myself," Florence explained, suddenly shy. "The gloves are from the store, but I noticed yours were worn through." Wade ran his fingers over the scarf, then looked up with an expression that made her breath catch. "No one's made something for me since my mother died. Thank you. You're welcome." Florence busied herself with extinguishing one of the lamps, needing a moment to compose herself. "Florence," Wade's voice was closer now, directly behind her. "About that conversation we never finished." She turned to face him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Yes." He took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "I'm not good with words, never have been, but I need to say this plain. I care for you, more than I thought possible after. Everything." Florence stood very still, afraid that any movement might shatter this moment. "I care for you too," she whispered. Wade moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Been thinking about kissing you since Thanksgiving," he admitted, his voice rough. "Maybe longer. What's stopping you?" The boldness of her own question surprised her, but she didn't regret it. For an answer, Wade gently cupped her face in his hands and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Florence answered by stepping closer, her hands coming to rest on his chest as she returned the kiss with all the feeling she had kept carefully contained for months. When they finally parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers, his breath coming quickly. "Been wanting to do that since the first day," he murmured. "Why didn't you?" Florence asked, her own voice unsteady. Wasn't sure you'd welcome it. You kept everyone at a distance, especially men. His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. Figured you had your reasons. I did, she acknowledged. Fear, mostly. Fear of being hurt again. I won't hurt you, Wade promised solemnly. Not ever if I can help it. Florence believed him this man of few words whose actions always spoke more loudly than any declaration. I know. He kissed her again, more deeply this time, his arms encircling her waist to draw her closer. Florence felt something unfurling within her: hope, joy, desire, emotions she had thought herself incapable of after William's rejection. When they separated, Wade picked up the silver pendant from her desk. May I? He asked, holding it up. Florence nodded, turning so he could fasten it around her neck. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin at her nape, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter chill. Perfect, he said as she turned back to face him, the pendant gleaming in the lamplight against her dress. Like it was made for you. It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received, she told him sincerely. Wanted to give you something special. Wade's expression turned serious. Florence, I know it might be too soon, but I need you to know this isn't casual for me. When I look at you, I see my future. The simple, heartfelt declaration brought tears to Florence's eyes. No one has ever looked at me the way you do, she admitted. As if I'm somehow precious. You are. Wade brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Beautiful, brilliant, brave, everything I never knew I was waiting for. Florence placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady beat beneath her palm. I came west to escape the past, not expecting to find a future, but here you are. Here I am, he agreed, covering her hand with his own. And here I'll stay, as long as you want me. That might be a very long time, Sheriff Turner. A smile spread slowly across his face, not the reserved half-smile she was accustomed to, but a full, radiant expression of joy. I'm counting on it, Miss Montgomery. Outside, snow began to fall again, dusting the windowsills with white. Inside the schoolhouse, Florence Montgomery, who had traveled 2,000 miles to escape heartbreak, found herself willingly risking her heart again in the arms of a man who saw her beauty when no one else had bothered to look. Spring came late to Willow Creek that year. April brought lingering snowstorms, interspersed with days of brilliant sunshine that turned the streets to mud and sent creeks overflowing their banks with snowmelt from the mountains. Florence and Wade's courtship progressed through the winter months with a deliberate pace that respected both their positions in the small community. They attended church together on Sundays, shared meals at the boarding house several times a week, and Wade continued to walk Florence home from school each afternoon, though these walks now often included detours to the river or up into the foothills when weather permitted. Their growing relationship was the subject of much approving gossip in town. Florence found herself receiving knowing smiles from shopkeepers and extra helpings at church suppers, while Wade endured good-natured teasing from the town council members. Never thought I'd see the day, Mayor Franklin remarked one evening as they sat in the sheriff's office reviewing town business. Our confirmed bachelor sheriff, walking out with the schoolmarm. Wade merely smiled, unperturbed by the ribbing. Man can change his mind when given sufficient reason. In private moments, Florence marveled at the transformation in her life. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 9 months earlier, heartbroken, defensive, determined to need no one, had gradually given way to someone who found joy in connection, who looked forward rather than back. You're different, Mrs. Holloway observed one evening as they sat in the parlor, Florence grading papers while the older woman knitted. Happier, it suits you. Florence glanced up with a smile. I am happy, more than I thought possible. Sheriff's a good man, Mrs. Holloway continued, needles clicking steadily. Been alone too long, that one. Needed someone to remind him there's more to life than duty. We've helped each other, I think, Florence replied thoughtfully. He reminds me that vulnerability isn't weakness. As spring advanced, bringing wildflowers to the hillsides and new leaves to the cottonwoods along the creek, Florence found herself contemplating a future she hadn't dared imagine when she came west. Though Wade had made no formal proposal, their conversations increasingly included references to shared tomorrows. One Saturday in early May, Wade arrived at the boarding house on horseback, leading a second mount. "Thought you might like to see something," he said when Florence appeared on the porch. "If you're not too busy." "I'm never too busy for you," she replied, enjoying the way his eyes warmed at her words. "Where are we going?" "It's a surprise." He helped her mount the gentle mare he had brought for her. "Hope you don't mind a bit of a ride." They rode north out of town, following a trail that wound through pine forests and meadows bright with spring flowers. Florence, who had learned to ride during the winter under Wade's patient tutelage, felt comfortable enough to enjoy the scenery rather than concentrate solely on staying in the saddle. After about an hour, they crested a hill to find a breathtaking view spread before them, the valley below with Willow Creek, visible as a cluster of buildings beside the silver ribbon of the creek, and mountains rising majestically beyond. "It's beautiful," Florence exclaimed, reining in beside Wade. "One of my favorite spots," he agreed, dismounting and helping her down. "But not what I brought you to see." He took her hand and led her a short distance through the trees to a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin not new, but solid and well-maintained, with a stone chimney and a covered porch across the front. Wildflowers grew in profusion around it, and a small stream chattered nearby. "Wade," Florence looked at him questioningly. "It was my brother's," he explained, leading her toward the cabin. "Built it himself when he first came west. After he died, couldn't bear to sell it, but couldn't live here either. Too many memories." He produced a key and unlocked the door, gesturing for Florence to enter. Inside was a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end. Simple furniture, a table, chairs. A bed frame was covered with cloths to protect it from dust. Windows on 3 walls let in the spring sunshine, illuminating the space. "It's lovely," Florence said, turning slowly to take it all in. "So peaceful." Wade watched her, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Been coming up here the past few months, fixing things, clearing out the worst memories." He took a deep breath. "Thought maybe we could make new ones." Florence's heart raced as she realized what he was saying. "Wade," he crossed to her in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. "I love you, Florence Montgomery. Have for months now. Want to spend my life with you if you'll have me." Tears filled Florence's eyes as joy bloomed within her. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much." Wade reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, hand-carved like the music box he had given her at Christmas. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the sunlight streaming through the windows. "Belonged to my grandmother," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Had it sized for you." "It's beautiful," Florence breathed as he slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if meant for her hand all along. "Will you marry me, Florence? Be my wife, help me make this place a home again." For answer, Florence wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him with all the love that had grown in her heart since that first day when he had called her beautiful and meant it. When they finally parted, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Wade's smile was radiant as he lifted her off her feet in a jubilant embrace, spinning her around the sunlit cabin that would become their home. They were married in June, with wildflowers decorating the church and the entire town in attendance. Florence wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Holloway and the other women had helped her make, with her mother's lace veil sent from Boston for the occasion. Wade, resplendent in a new suit, looked at her with such love as she walked down the aisle that Florence felt beautiful in a way no mirror could ever reflect. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Wade kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Florence's eyes and approving sighs from the congregation. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with dancing and feasting that rivaled the town's Thanksgiving festivities. As dusk fell, the newlyweds slipped away, riding to the cabin on the hill that was now their home, ready to begin the next chapter of their lives together. Their happiness only deepened as the years passed. The cabin grew with their family, a new room added when their first child, a son they named James, was born a year after their wedding. A daughter, Mary, followed 2 years later, with another son, Daniel, completing their family 3 years after that. Florence continued teaching until her first pregnancy, then returned part-time once James was old enough for Mrs. Holloway to mind during school hours. Wade remained sheriff, but delegated more responsibilities to his deputy as their family grew, ensuring he was present for the important moments in their children's lives. The town grew as well, with the railroad arriving in 1883, bringing new prosperity and opportunities. Through all the changes, Wade and Florence remained constants in the community, respected, admired, and deeply in love. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin watching their children play in the summer twilight, Wade reached for Florence's hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding band that now complemented her engagement ring. "Happy?" he asked, though he knew the answer. Florence smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Completely, and you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, Florence Turner." "And you're still the only man who's ever truly made me feel that way," she replied softly. As darkness fell, and the stars emerged above the mountains, Florence reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place from a heartbroken young woman, fleeing rejection, to a beloved wife, mother, and teacher, who had found her true home in the arms of a man who had seen her beauty when she couldn't see it herself. In the end, it wasn't about being called beautiful that had changed her life. It was about being truly seen, being valued for all that she was rather than judged for what she wasn't. Wade had given her that gift from the very beginning, and she had returned it in full measure, healing his wounded heart even as he healed hers. Their love story had begun with a simple act of honest appreciation, a cowboy who called her beautiful, and meant it, and had grown into a life more rich and fulfilling than either had dared to dream. And on that quiet summer evening, surrounded by the family they had created together, Florence knew with absolute certainty that their best chapters were still being written, day by day, in the life they shared.